Well, I think of boarding school as a prep school primarily, or a delinquent school where you get sent off when you're bad.
Personally, I think of like a bunch of British kids and their nice like jackets and ties and uniforms and whatnot.
My mom went to a boarding school. She didn't like it. They weren't allowed to speak our language or they get whipped or something.
Usually I think of like a school on the East Coast, you know, with like a lot of preppy people and lacrosse and stuff. I don't know.
When I think about boarding school in Montana, I usually just think back of like government putting Native Americans into boarding schools.
It would be very difficult to go away from everything you've known.
Younger Indian kids were sent there in order to kind of take them away from the Indian culture and kind of mold them into the white culture, which is really a sad thing because we're losing a lot of that Indian culture.
When European American immigrants settled here in the 19th century, Montana's native inhabitants suffered in many ways. Treaty and non-treaty federal actions established reservations and then systematically reduced them in size. White settlers killed animals that American Indians depended on and never provided substitute rations. Conflicting federal policies first tried to isolate American Indians and then assimilate them into white society. In both cases, whites wanted to limit American Indian presence and power. One assimilation strategy involved the establishment of Indian boarding schools. These institutions existed on, near, and far removed from reservations. Boarding schools often separated students from their families and cultural traditions. Further, to strip Indian children of their heritage, many boarding schools invoked extreme practices. The boarding school experience still casts a long shadow over the lives and the culture of many Montana Indians. From the earliest days, Montana has been a place of population movement. At no time was this more evident than the 20th century. Numerous federal policies affected the movement of people within the state as well as to and from the state. Events throughout the history catapulted the state's population. Fluctuations including leaving for war and the gain and loss of industry, but the longest lasting of the forced relocations was the Indian boarding schools.
If we look at the history of education as it affects the indigenous peoples of the country, we really should, in all fairness, go back in time prior to 1492 and acknowledge the fact that indigenous peoples had developed their own school systems. That by the time you got a child matured to adulthood, they were very capable, competent individuals who could speak their languages fluently, who knew their own history as a peoples, who were very skilled artisans. There was this very strong awareness of how to function and live in relationship to one's environment, because we believe that all life has a spirit and that all life is related. We really live in an interrelational world. And this was certainly Native philosophy. And we taught the children that they lived in that relational universe and that they had responsibilities. We had our own ways of educating our young people to to be very capable, competent adults. 1568, where the first schools were established, once they began to penetrate the interior of the continent, wanted to anglicize us, to take away our own sense of identity and who we are through the new kinds of educational systems that they imported.
The boarding schools began with the Carlisle Indian School in 1879. The boarding school movement, if it's called that, is a product of a philosophy of assimilation that's also marked by that time period. This was one way of assimilating Native peoples into the American mainstream society.
To change a people, you begin with their children. So that was what the schools were aimed at doing, changing us as a people and beginning with our children.
The reason why it was such a traumatic experience for children, particularly in the early reservation period, is that the children had been growing up in a community that was much different from the boarding schools. And in fact, the school system itself was designed to be wholly supportive of a different kind of cultural lifestyle.
To make us more like them so that we could be dealt with and controlled, and to make room and space for other people. My mom always says the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so, you know, they may have thought this is what is best for Indian people, you know, but it wasn't what Indian people were determining was best for them.
By 1900, the federal government was in its fourth educational strategy to kill American Indian culture. Church-run missions first had dominated the white education of Indians. Next, Indian day schools on reservations had been introduced. Reservation-based boarding schools soon followed. And then finally, boarding schools were located outside reservations. The plan was simple and cruel. Take students far enough away from their families for a long enough time, and they would become white in speech, work skills, and attitudes.
General Pratt, you know, his motto was kill the Indian and save the man. So the idea of removing children became, I guess, practiced in. It would be hard for any of us to imagine, those of us that are parents or grandparents, if someone came and took our children and we were to never see them again.
Tribes were receiving rations from the federal government in the form of cattle or flour. Ration days where people would come and collect their foodstuffs. It was then easy for the federal government to identify family units and know which children were around, which children were not in school.
So some people allowed their children to go so that they could eat, so that they'd have food and they'd be protected in that way. And other people protested, and Indian agents regularly used intimidation or the withholding of rations to coerce parents into sending their kids. And if you talk to elders, they all have stories of kids literally being rounded up by Indian agents coming through in a car or a truck, and your children would literally be taken. And if you think of the 1800s, it would be impossible for an Indian parent at that time to travel thousands of miles to try to get their children or even to try to see them.
The first thing that happened was that their kids' hair would be cut off, because long hair, particularly on males, is always associated with savagery and wildness. But culturally, hair has always been associated with power, with spirituality.
From a cultural, spiritual, and native perspective, the hair is an extension of one's soul.
As a sign of mourning, people cut their hair. The closer they cut their hair, the closer the person was who passed away. And so the first thing that happens is the child's hair is cut, and he or she is not really sure why. not knowing the culture of the white man, and assuming, therefore, that somebody must have died, and they don't speak English typically at that time. So it must have been very confusing and traumatic to them to have something as simple as a haircut. Captain Richard Pratt was a military person in charge of prisoner of war detainees during the Civil War, took that model, the military regimentation, and applied that to the boarding schools. And so children dressed in uniforms, military style. They marched to school, they marched to classes.
The books they used were, I think, Keeps, K-E-E-P-S, Keeps books for the deaf and the dumb. Dick and Jane and Spot books. What relevancy and meaning does that have to a child just off the plains, the prairies, the forests, the woodlands, the coasts of this country? The children had very long days. They would get up very early in the morning, say 5 or 6 in the morning.
A lot of boarding schools were really run on the labor of children. And so children did cooking, they did cleaning, they did laundry, they did farming. So only a portion of their day was actually spent in an educational or academic setting.
I have about 3 hours of classwork, break for lunch, and then go and do work in the various trades.
And so they spent their afternoon doing things like, for the girls, sewing, learning how to cook, learning how to clean. And for the boys, they received a specific kind of training in a job that they would do after they graduated.
There are stories of physical abuse, emotional violence, verbal violence, shaming. I think shaming was an everyday practice and a steady diet for Indian children to feel shame, not really for anything that you've done, but simply for who you are.
Those schools were into completely reshaping the Indian child, culturally, spiritually, physically, and I guess even we can say environmentally. If my language is not good, if I cannot no longer dress the way that I was accustomed to dressing, if I can no longer learn the skills and the knowledge that make me who I am as an Indian child, then that must not be good for me. And so you can see the impact upon the self-image of the child, how they would feel about themselves.
In many cases, the only role models that they had were dorm parents who were charged with taking care of 60 or 70 children, children who have a negative or an absent parental model is not going to have the same kind of skills when he or she becomes a parent. Some of the legacies of that are, from the sociologic point of view, increased child abuse, child neglect, patterns of abusive behavior, sexual abuse, alcoholism, all of which can be traced back to the boarding school era. Boarding schools educated probably about 2/3 of the children who were educated. 20% of the children graduated from high school. The other 80% would return home or just simply would not finish the required term of study.
I'm certain that there were some people that worked at boarding schools that had the best interest of children at heart. And I've talked to some elders that felt like going to the school and learning what they did was necessary for them to be able to survive in such a rapidly changing world.
One of my spiritual grandmothers said, "Oh, it was okay." She said, "We couldn't talk Cheyenne. Yes, we're punished for it." She said, "But it was kind of nice," she said, "to wear these blue wool capes that they issued to us." She said they were elegant.
When people talk about the boarding school experiences, you either hear the very horrible kinds of stories of abuse or neglect, malnutrition, Then there's the stories which talk about how fond people remember those times and the good friends that they had. Anthropologist Simon Ortiz describes this as something of a survivor's syndrome, where you have people who have managed to survive the experience look back at it fondly. Those who didn't survive it, the victims of alcoholism or of disease or abuse, just simply don't tell those kind of stories. And so you have those contrasting views. When you ask non-Indian kids, they think that, well, you know, I don't have a culture, I'm white. Well, yeah, you do. You have a culture. It's based upon your experiences, your parents' experiences. You might be Irish, but what does that mean? We study history so that we can become more informed about who we are and how we got to be who we are. When I teach students, I don't ask them, when I talk about the boarding schools, to feel badly about it. All I'm asking is, can you understand that we are a product of that history? We are a product of that education philosophy. And who we are today is because our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents experienced that. That's all I want you to do, is understand that. I think the first step toward respecting one another is to understand where we're coming from.